Hey everyone, and welcome to the Free Assange Vigil Week 43. That is incredible. My name is Steve Poikinen. I am joined this evening by Andrew Smith, Misty Wilson, and Kendra, whose name I can't remember. I'm sorry, Kendra, I don't know.
Christian, it's all right.
Okay. We are we are in kind of a state of flux for the first time with the second round of Julian Assange's extradition hearing. We found out yesterday that it will be postponed to maybe July, but also maybe November. Having said that, today marks 3,429 days of unlawful and arbitrary detention since Julian went into the Ecuadorian embassy, 379 days since he was sold to the British government for a $4.2 billion IMF loan and trafficked to Belmarsh prison, and 1,059 days since Reality Winner was taken into federal custody for leaking information. And on the positive side, we are happy to announce that it is Chelsea Manning's 46th day of freedom after the closure of the WikiLeaks grand jury. Our guests tonight are Kevin Zeese and Danny Sjursen. We are looking forward to this one. So without any further delay, gentlemen, let's jump right into it. Kevin, how are the Embassy Protector 4 doing? And if you could just kind of update the folks watching as to what you went through, and then the court proceeding as a result of that.
Sure. Well, I mean, a year ago at this time, we were inside the Venezuelan embassy. This was before the right-wing siege. There were probably about 50 people sleeping there at the time, and we were going in and out, no problem. We were having fantastic forums. People were coming in, about 100 people a night, to various events and cultural music and AFRICOM and all sorts of issues we were talking about. It was fantastic. And then on the 30th and May 1st, we had a siege that began where they were surrounded by a right-wing pro-coup mob that was being helped by the Secret Service to threaten us and keep us from having food in the embassy. We fought with that to get food in with allies outside. They were amazing efforts to bring us food. We were able to break through a handful of times and keep ourselves fed. It gradually whittled down to 4 of us in the end who were arrested. They invaded the embassy illegally, violating the Vienna Convention, which prohibits any host government from going into an embassy without the permission of the government that owns the embassy. But the U.S. came in anyway. They had more than 100 police outside, many in military gear. They broke the door down with a battering ram and came in. Arrested us and charged us with federal offense. We were facing federal charges for interfering with the protective function of the State Department. And we finally, after almost a year, went to trial. They were unable to convict us. There was a mistrial because the jury would not agree on conviction. That was really surprising because it was a very strange court proceeding. In that courtroom, Juan Guaido was the president. We couldn't correct that record and tell them that President Maduro was the president and that we were there with the permission of the actual elected government of Venezuela to protect the embassy. The jury was told that Juan Guaido was the president and that the fake ambassador who asked us to be taken out was a real ambassador. And he was really nothing at all, not an ambassador at all. And so the jury was misled, but even with that, the jury would not convict us. So that was an amazing victory. And we then remained silent about what to do next. It was up to the government whether to prosecute us or not. About a week before the trial was scheduled, they contacted us and said they were going to go ahead with the prosecution, but they wanted to offer us a plea agreement. And the plea agreement was to drop the federal charge and instead charge us with a very minor charge called incommoding, which is when you basically refuse to stop blocking the street. That's how it's usually used. And we're in the process of still negotiating that agreement, and we'll see how that turns out June 3rd. We've talked to our legal defense committee. We've talked to our Venezuelan allies, both in the U.S. and Venezuela, and everyone agrees that if they drop the federal charges and charge us with an offense that's essentially like spitting on the street, that's a tremendous victory. So if we can work it out, that's what we hope to do. We'll see. We'll know on June 3rd. But the four of us are doing well. We're all very active in our own work. Margaret Flowers and I run Popular Resistance at popularresistance.org. We have lots of projects that we're working on. David Paul in California has continued his work on Latin American and other peace issues. Adrienne Pine continues to do her work on Honduras, where she's been an anthropologist working for 20 years and teaching at American University in Washington, D.C. So we're all doing well, hoping we can work this out. We'll see. There's a lot of details to finish, but we'll know on June 3rd.
It always amazes me that, because I had read that the jury was given those specific instructions and they had to recognize the legitimacy of the fake puppet Juan Guaido, and also the legitimacy of the fake puppet ambassador Carlos Vecchio, who couldn't even give anyone out a passport.
That's right.
He didn't have that privilege or that power, and yet he was supposed to be recognized as the ambassador. Danny, I'd like your take on this whole thing, because you're here because you've written extensively from a former military perspective on whistleblowers and a number of the things of that nature. But what was your take when the whole siege of the Venezuelan embassy was going down?
Well, thanks for having me here, first of all. I'm kind of just happy to be here, sort of as an aspirationally reformed former imperial water carrier. I'm just glad to be in the room. But I do like to think of sort of what I do now as, lapsed Catholic penance of sorts. I do have some pretty strong feelings about the Venezuela issue in general, the siege more specifically. Let's just back up and come to today. And what we're seeing is that there's a Wild West bounty hunter aspect to American foreign policy in Venezuela. And it is like Back to the Future, because we saw this with Noriega in Panama in '89. We're putting bounties on people's heads. It's Bin Laden all over again. But all of it, of course, is a charade. And it's in the name of an illegitimate government, a coup fostered in the light of day that really no one talks about. And I think that does connect to, Assange and the press. I mean, how is it that we've gotten to a place where we can say, there's this other guy in charge, right? It's a Guaido government because we say so, and we're going to prosecute you in the United States based on that lie, right? All of this is happening, but it's in the light of day. It's not the other September 11th in Chile where it's secretive. It's not the CIA putting poison toothpaste on Patrice Lumumba's, toothbrush in the Congo. That stuff at least was, for the most part, under, secretive. Now, it wasn't any better, but what's really striking about the Venezuela thing is that we'll cruise our ships by, we'll declare essentially Wild West vigilantism, and it all happens in the light of day. No one questions it, and it just goes on. This is the ultimate militarism in a sense, and people don't recognize it oftentimes. I know a lot of people listening here will, but out there, right, whatever that is, most folks don't think America's an empire. And they certainly don't think that American behavior of this sort is imperial, because technically school kids in Massachusetts or Milwaukee aren't coloring in countries, red like the British kids in London did. And so this gunboat diplomacy, because that's what it is, and these legal charades about who's in charge, which really is just a coup, it sort of flies under the radar. And I think that's by design. And in some ways, it proves to me that maybe Huxley was right and not Orwell.
I think it can be a little column A, a little column B there, honestly, because
Agreed.
The level of surveillance that we're experiencing and will be experiencing in this sort of post-COVID reality that they're trying to push on us. Man, I had something and my kid was freaking out and I had to jump up and I lost it. If any of the co-hosts want to jump in, that'd be great too.
Yeah, I was going to say on the comment of that or post-COVID reality, we're seeing contact tracing roll out across the board. We're seeing mass surveillance efforts across the globe. Millions of people locked into house arrest. While at the same time, the actual people on the front lines working, the grocery store workers, the fast foods, the restaurants, the truck drivers, aren't being provided with the basic equipment that they need and can use, but we have no problem expanding the surveillance state at a rapid pace with new legislation. Could you talk a little bit, Kevin, about your efforts to get a general strike started and what people can do to get involved with that?
Well, that's great. It's great lead into it. I mean, I'll tell you, it's such an interesting thing, this pandemic, because what you describe as far as the lockdown and all and the mistreatment of frontline workers, it's all symptoms of a very failed political system and failed political economy. The reason why we have to take this close the economy down approach is because our public health system is almost non-existent. We've underfunded it. We've privatized it. We put the insurance companies in charge, and the pharmaceutical companies are allowed to rip people off. And so we have a corrupt healthcare system, and we see how workers are treated. And so because of all this is all becoming more clear and more magnified in this pandemic. And that's causing a lot of anger. And so people are organizing what's being called a general strike campaign. You can see about it on popularresistance.org, and one of our top stories there talks about the general strike beginning on May 1st. This will be an ongoing campaign that goes every first day of the month from here into the foreseeable future, probably past the presidential election. I think it'll probably go as far as 2022, in fact. I think this is a long-term campaign. And general strikes are something that are not common in the United States. In fact, it's not part of our history. It's common in places like France and other European countries. But in the United States, strikes have been very difficult. They've almost been made illegal, and especially for public workers. But in the last couple of years, we have seen a tremendous upsurge in strikes. In fact, more strikes in the last 2 years than we've had for 35 years. Each of the last 2 years, 400,000 workers have gone on strike. That's a big number. And there have been a series of wildcat strikes during the COVID crisis this year. And I call them wildcat strikes because they're being done without unions. The unions aren't allowed to strike in some of these areas. And so the workers go on strike on their own and bring the union along with them at the back end. And so the general strike is going to be something that grows. It's going to be a whole variety of tactics. We're going to be doing a Zoom call on Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Eastern time. You can read about it on Popular Resistance, that article I mentioned about the general strike. And it's going to be to talk about what can be done in this lockdown situation. They're going to be caravans, people protesting the economy and the healthcare system, and the need to relieve prisoners, and students are out protesting for real schools and how they're going to be treated in the fall. There are rent strikes going on. There's a tremendous, we have an article on Popular Resistance about that as well yesterday. 40 cities had rent strike protests yesterday. So there's an uprising. And if we do this right, I mean, I'm really excited about it. Reminds me when we organized Occupy. We didn't know when we started Occupy a year before it started how it would turn out. And it turned out to be a game changer, put new issues on the agenda, and really has had reverberations that still impact today. This general strike campaign could be much bigger than that and could really set the agenda, would build people power. I mean, with the choice of Biden versus Trump, I'm voting for Howie Hawkins and the Green Party, but for a choice of Biden versus Trump, people are angry about that. It's two candidates. It's the worst candidates we've seen since the last election, and so people are angry about that. They're angry about the way the economy is going, the way the virus is being handled, the way workers are treated, students are treated, prisoners. There's a lot of anger in this country, and it's going to come together in this general strike campaign. I'm very excited about it. It's got great potential.
Is it at all related to I got invited to a group called Corona Strike, and there's a
Yeah, that's part of it. They're part of it too. Sure.
Okay. Yeah. I was just making sure. Eric Helblas is someone I've known for a number of years. I co-founded a political party with her in 2015.
Right. Yeah, I was on a conference call with her last night. Yeah, she's part of this as well.
Just making sure. Danny, I wanted to ask you a question because you'd written a fantastic article, and then subsequently had a podcast about whistleblowers in the military. And I obviously know your stance on Chelsea Manning, but while you were active or while you were teaching, because you were a history teacher at West Point too, if I have that right.
That's right.
Was there any kind of camaraderie or solidarity with Chelsea Manning at that point, or was it pretty much fuck this person? We're here to follow orders, not make decisions.
I really wish that I had something better to report in terms of the general culture in the military. I am seeing changes, but let me kind of break it down. So when I was teaching at the academy, this is 2014 to 16. Then I was actually at Fort Leavenworth. I was stationed there when Chelsea Manning was first released. So I was there for some key years. I was in the belly of the beast. I will tell you that for the most part, especially among the mid and senior level officers that I kind of hung around with, there was total dismissal of Chelsea Manning as a traitor. There was a lot of ad hominem that sort of just surrounded, gender and all these issues. I mean, there was a lot of smoke about unrelated issues. The military is really at a crisis point, I do think, and everyone says that, and then it doesn't turn out. But I'm seeing some rumblings. Where am I seeing them? Okay, we know that polling says 75% of veterans want out of Afghanistan. Well, that may sound unrelated, but that is a cultural shift. The text messages that I get from former students who, should be the most rah-rah point in their career, lieutenants, and they're in Afghanistan or they're here, not only being positive about ending these wars that maybe they want to get out of, but starting to show a little bit of solidarity with these sorts of broader issues. This issue on the aircraft carrier, I think, was also important. Today,
I was actually just about to ask you about that with the captain on the aircraft carrier that released the information about COVID-19 and having to dock in Guam. Because I have a buddy who came out of the Navy a couple years ago and had still been in contact with a lot of his friends. And he said there was, I don't want to call it like a mutiny, but essentially they started organizing themselves on the actual ship about this issue. So could you talk a little bit about the larger military culture that surrounds his exiting?
Well, this was a remarkable thing. I saw a schism among my peers, my friends, and my detractors, and all together, because I write for a lot of places and I'm on a lot of sort of social media, former West Pointers, former military folks, and there is a civil war brewing. And where one fell on the Captain Crozier issue was just one small litmus test. And I wrote an article about it called, Common Decency or Company Men, when you have to take a stand. But I'll tell you, today was the day when casualties for corona, deaths from corona, surpassed the Vietnam War. Okay, the number of deaths. And something that people forget, and this does relate back to your question, I promise. Something people forget about that war ending is that Congress didn't end it. They never really shut the money off. The president certainly didn't really end it. A lot of factors came together, mainly the Vietnamese winning. But one of the main factors was GI resistance. GI resistance. And it's almost totally forgotten. It's been whitewashed. It's convenient that it should be. The military hates any talk of that. And it's largely one of the reasons they went to the all-volunteer force. What you had was you had soldiers at the lower level organizing newspapers in like salons and cafes, political groups, and then at the higher level, rolling grenades into aggressive officers' tents. I don't condone that, but the point is that there was resistance. Yep. On the carrier, a lot of the reporting I've seen from the inside and just the public reporting is the support that they showed for Crozier and the defiance. Maybe it's maybe it's low level, maybe it's cheering, maybe it's social media posts, whatever it is. There was a level of defiance from that crew, and also from a lot of the junior officers, from what I've heard and been told, against the Navy's decision. So, okay, this isn't exactly a mutiny, but what we did see, like you mentioned, is some degree of organizing, a desire to get the message out through their families a lot of the times. Hey, we support this guy. We do not support the president. We do not support the, chief of naval operations. And I think this was a really important point. I'd like to see more of it in the Army. What we do know is that the Secretary of the Army reversed himself a few weeks ago from what was actually pretty reasonable or somewhat reasonable guidance to basically cancel anything that was inessential. Well, they actually rescinded that order and went ahead with 4,000 and 5,000 man exercises with, joint Marines and Army, kicking down doors in model cities in the Emirati desert that were modeled on Iranian cities. It's really that insane that in a time of pandemic, we're still just assuming that, the new Cold War should go on and we got to be prepared. So I would love to see some sit-down strikes in the military. I don't suspect that there'll be anything too overt at first, because military usually does not lead on those sort of activities. The all-volunteer force was crafted to avoid that, and we can talk about that at some other point. But, a lot of the reason we have volunteers is so that we don't have a politically active citizenry that's as likely to do those things. But in a time of pandemic, we're starting to see rumblings.
Hey, Danny, I want to ask you something. Maybe now that you're out of the military and in different circles. I travel in circles of veterans, and when I was working on the Chelsea Manning case, I was involved in her case from the beginning. I was on the steering committee of the support committee. We did protests at the Virginia fort where she was being held. There were a lot of veterans there, a lot of veterans for peace, Iraq veterans against the war, a lot of strong veteran group. People come out of the military. They may go in with their eyes closed, but many come out with their eyes open. And they see really from the inside the behavior of the military. I actually saw a video you were in. I think it was a piece of a movie where you were basically the top-down orders in Iraq, putting your troops in danger. People see that, and I think they know that what Manning released and what WikiLeaks published, those truths were truths. They know that there were war crimes committed in Iraq and Afghanistan. They know Guantanamo, the prisoners are treated horribly. They know that the State Department acts for the transnational corporations. And so when we were working on Chelsea Manning, we got a lot of leadership from veterans. Veterans were very key. In fact, the guy who led the Chelsea Manning Support Committee, Jeff Patterson, is a vet himself, and he is very active politically in fighting against the war machine. So do you see that also in the new you're in?
I definitely, I belong to both Veterans for Peace and, of course, Iraq Veterans Against the War, which they now is about face. I even have dabbled with the Libertarians and Bring Our Troops Home, or whatever they call it. So, I'm in a lot of these organizations. I'm definitely inspired by the veterans anti-war movement. It is picking up steam again. For a long time, people were sort of declaring it dead. And I think that was never really fair. But the idea was, Veterans for Peace, I spoke at the convention last year. They are older, and there are a lot more Vietnam-era veterans. And so I think there was this sense that as the draftees, kind of got older, that this was going to end. But actually, there's a lot of new blood in it.
That's right.
For better or for worse, I think for worse in some ways, the American people trust soldiers and veterans.
They do.
I think that there's problems with that for the health of a republic when the only public institution we care about is soldiers on the 50-yard line rather than social workers. But this is the reality. And so if there are politically active veterans with kind of good hearts and good policies, well, then we need to use those voices, because if the American people give them credibility, whether we deserve it or not, inherently, we got to use it. And so I do think that there's hope out there. Maybe not optimism, but definitely hope. And I'm inspired by the people in About Face and Iraq Veterans Against the War and then Veterans for Peace. So it's out there, it's growing, and I'm telling you, there's rumblings on active duty. I know enough people who are still on who text me, and yeah, maybe they say, don't tell anybody that I just texted you this, but it's still something to know that there are people in uniform who are like, this is bullshit, and they say it.
One question that I had for you, Danny, is just how important, when the WikiLeaks did release, the Iraq files, the Afghanistan files, and the collateral murder, how important was that for you as a veteran?
Well, it was huge. I was on active duty when all that happened. I was in Iraq during the height of the Civil War. The first way that I actually kind of got involved with WikiLeaks and the Iraq War reports is that when I kind of lost my mind in grad school and decided to just write and ended up writing an accidental memoir, I used those files. I mean, I used the WikiLeaks data to piece together, in some cases, events that I kind of remembered, but just kind of getting the details right. What time did we get attacked? Well, that's the small stuff. But then as I was doing my research and broadening the point to like talk about the Iraq War in general, one of the things that struck me was that when I was there in 2006 and 7, so this is the height of the Civil War. We're talking thousands of civilians dead a month. And one of my jobs, quite frankly, was to drive around in the morning and count and, hand over the bodies to the Iraqi police. And so we would count them. We would try to identify Sunni and Shia because the military counts everything. Well, why is that relevant? Well, beyond the fact that it just emotionally scarred me and thousands of others, at the same time, the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they kept saying on TV, and the President, there's no civil war. It's not a civil war. Don't use that word, in fact, they would say. Well, the WikiLeaks files, one of the many things they did, probably not the most important, but one of the important things, was identify that below the surface, everyone was talking about it at the military high command level, that this was a civil war, that look at this data on civilian casualties. So the American people were being lied to. We were being lied to, which was insulting because I was like carrying the evidence some mornings. And it did actually get me thinking about the press in a different way. And I was on active duty during this time. And I was already in the midst of kind of turmoil of who am I? Can you change the system from within? The answer is usually no. And I stayed for a lot of bad reasons. But it was part of my awakening. And of course, I'll never forget the collateral damage videos. One of the things that struck me about that was how common it was. This got a lot of story because admittedly it was a pretty atrocious instance, maybe worse than normal, right? Or than typically. However, I tell people, and I write about this, if killing civilians was not an expected possibility, then the military wouldn't have a term for it that we have, a study that we have to do, a calculus called CDE, collateral damage estimate. In fact, I would have to call a lawyer. Well, I'd have to call headquarters who would check with a lawyer based on like this ridiculous esoteric formula, and they would put a number on it, what the collateral damage estimate was. And depending where that number was, the airstrike that I just called was, approved or denied. And I can tell you, it wasn't half as strict or as stringent as they made it out to be. So that's a long way of saying that for me, WikiLeaks, Assange and Manning in general, and what they revealed, it was pretty life altering. It really was.
So I wanted to ask, and this is kind of both for Danny and Kevin, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying about us being lied to. It seems like, and I've said this before, that the kind of the issue that we're most dealing with is narrative control. And I kind of wanted to get both of your takes on what you think we could be doing better to combat the propaganda, and also what your take is on how propaganda has pushed us in the direction kind of that we're going, and why WikiLeaks is so important in that fight against it.
Wow, that's
go first. I called it. You go first.
That's a big question with lots of really great angles on it. First off, I think WikiLeaks was important, and Assange's work was important, was because he exposed truths that the government was trying to hide, and he democratized the media, and that's the most important. A democratized media means not a corporate-controlled media, but a people's-controlled media. WikiLeaks made it for people to blow the whistle anonymously and expose the truth. And that is very scary for the government. That's very scary for the corporate media, because the corporate media works so closely with the government. I mean, the New York Times was essentially publishing Dick Cheney press releases as if they were a fact. And the whole weapons of mass destruction story from the New York Times and Washington Post, was essentially them serving government. And that we see that so often. We see it over in Venezuela, the incredible lies in the Washington Post. We were in the embassy. The Washington Post reporting was like they were embedded with the opposition. It was just a totally false story. So I think the democratization of the media is really powerful. And that's why I don't think you see the corporate media, even though they used WikiLeaks documents to report stories, they're not running to aid Julian Assange, because Julian Assange has put forward a new form of journalism that threatens the corporate media's existence. They threaten the corporate media's dominance of the narrative, and they give us incredible tools. We have barely used, as a society, we barely have used the incredible depth of information that WikiLeaks has published. The raw intelligence, that's what's so great about it. It's like not this varnished and cleaned up intelligence. This is just low-level intelligence reports that telling what's going on in key fronts, Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo, the State Department. It's just like, these are incredible historical and valuable documents. And so I expect in the future there will be historians who go through it in a much more careful way and piece together a history of the United States in this century that's not going to be something we're going to be very proud of. Even as in the current times when people are doing a partial job of using the WikiLeaks documents, we're already embarrassed by things like the collateral murder video and some of the documents, many of the documents that came out around Hillary Clinton during the last presidential election were very devastating to her because they told the truth about her. So that's why it's important. The battle over the narrative is key. That's why on Popular Resistance, we see our major purpose is giving people information that they can then become the media with. Every person in the United States now, if they want to be a media outlet, they don't have to do what you guys do, which is fantastic, doing this kind of a show, being real independent media, but through everyone's social media abilities, we are able to develop large networks of thousands and thousands of people. We can target information to media outlets, commercial media outlets, as well as political figures, business leaders, leaders of nonprofits, thought leaders. Incredible power we have as individuals, and we haven't done that well enough yet. We were starting to, and we were having an impact. Research was showing that the independent media, when they reported on a story and one publication would report on it, another publication, they would echo each other. They'd create a kind of an echo chamber of information and change the narrative. Well, we as individuals can do that. So that's why we put out a daily news digest, which we give people for free. It's about 15 articles a day. It's about 3 or 4 lines on each article. You get it in the mail at 6 or 7 in the morning. So you have 15 articles of news. You can go through them and pick out 2 or 3 that really turn you on. And as a media outlet, you can tell those stories. You can tell those on your media. So I think everybody has to really think of themselves as a potential media outlet with thousands of listeners and readers and important people reading your stuff. You can target to get important people to read it. And then then there are tools, our site and others, where you can get information and magnify them. So we have incredible potential power. And I think Julian Assange was a critical figure in showing that power. And that's why he's being treated so terribly for the last, since the collateral murder video came out. He's been a target of U.S. empire to destroy him, and he's paying a heavy price for it. So this show is important. The work to try to free him is important, but we should not forget how important Assange has been as a historical figure to create a democratized media.
I agree with that 100%. In a sense, I think the real crime, as you mentioned, is one of exposure and embarrassment. In a sense, what most upset the government, I know that it's also what usually upsets the military, is to be exposed, to be embarrassed.
That's right.
That's what Crozier did wrong. I mean, it's not what they said. It's that the media got the hold of it. It made them look bad. And of course, in a profound sense, that's what WikiLeaks did. And that was the real crime. I think that there's really an instructive juxtaposition here that helps to answer the original question. And it gets to what you call democratized media. And I think that's important. Let's take the WikiLeaks package, right? Everything that kind of came from that and that could have come from that but didn't. And let's compare it to what I like to call a polite exposure. And a polite exposure was what we saw in the Washington Post, not even a year ago, with the Afghanistan papers. So it took the Washington Post, some of the reporting was decent, and it took years because they played within the rules. They asked for these, special inspector general files that showed that all the generals and all the politicians knew we were failing and lied to us. And so some people said, well, it's just like the Pentagon Papers. And I think I even kind of compared it to that to a certain extent. But in reality, it wasn't even that good. It was more polite than that. And it was nothing compared to the democratized dump, and I mean that in a positive way, that came from, Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. Because
boy, democratized dump, that's quite a visual.
It's a collective.
So the way I actually look at the Pentagon Papers, Amazon released the Pentagon Papers shortly after their contract got pulled with the intelligence communities and the federal government to store their data on their cloud servers, and it was given to Microsoft. And a little while later, conveniently, like within a week or two, the Afghanistan papers came out of the Washington Post. Yeah. So I saw that, as good as it is to actually have that information in the public light, as Jeff Bezos getting mad that the government pulled a contract. So he was like, hey, I have this dirt on you. Like, what am I going to drop next time you pull a contract out from underneath me?
Wow.
Well, I think it was an interesting point, too, that you raised about the timing of that, because it seems that that's something that we've lost with the free press, which was always supposed to be a function of the free press, was to release things like this to the public in inconvenient times when we could still do something about it. And I'm wondering, Kevin, with the general strike, do you think, because I know we've had experience trying to bring in other activist groups, which seems like it would be a really easy thing. Whatever you care about, guess what? If you don't have free press, it's, there goes your fight. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that and how we could, just reach more people. And then also, Danny, I'm wondering if there's a lot of support for Julian Assange as well with the Veterans for Peace and these military groups. So.
Well, we saw this moment in the 2020s being a decade of potential transformation coming for a few years. There are a lot of issues that have been bubbling up in the United States around inequality, around police repression, around never-ending wars, on healthcare, treatment of workers. A lot of issues and movements have been building up around them. So you have these movements growing and these crisis issues developing. And so we saw the 2020s as a decade of transformation. Now that has been magnified more by the coronavirus and the economic collapse. And so in preparing for that decade of transformation, on Popular Resistance, what we did was a movement school. The Popular Resistance School is how social transformation occurs. And it's you can see on the top of this website, school, and it's 8 web-based classes with a pretty broad curriculum, lots of reading as well if people want it. And Margaret Flowers, the co-director of Popular Resistance, and I go through how you build movements, how you reach more people, what the goals of movements are, what the strategy, what the grand strategy is, what the tactics are to support that. And the basic strategy is to build a mass movement so you're not a fringe movement. And how do you do that? We go through some strategic tools you can use to analyze the situation that you're in, what issue you're working on, analyze it, figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are, what the opportunities are, and how you can build that movement. And I think at the foundation of every movement is education. And education is critical. And I think in the Julian Assange case, there are a number of areas of education you have to focus on. One is, of course, the great work he's done. We've talked about that a little bit. And also, I think it's important to put him into a historical context. He's essentially the equivalent of John Peter Zenger, who was a colonial era publisher who was prosecuted for publishing criticism of a governor of New York. And he was telling the truth, but he was prosecuted. And that ended up becoming the root cause of the First Amendment. I think Julian Assange defines free speech for the 21st century. So that's important to personalize, because the other part of the education you have to focus on with Assange is the character assassination against him. It's been a very methodical effort of character assassination with the sexual charges that were investigated. He was never indicted. Those charges were fraudulent from the beginning. And there's a pretty strong history that shows that. We have to re-educate people on that truth. Even just a lot of personality attacks against him, the way they spied him in the embassy and released some videos about that. It's just, we have a lot. So I think education is the first foundation. So you have to think about when you're trying to build an Assange movement, how do you educate people about this? The second thing, I think, in any movement, it's education. It's building your alliances and getting more people involved. That's that kind of organization is critical, and you have to reach out to people who are not involved and get them involved. And there's various techniques to do that. We talk about that in the school as well. And the third thing is mobilization. Once you have educated people, once you've organized them, then you can mobilize them and take action. But mobilization is the final step, and so you have to build that movement, and that goes true for whether it's a national movement or it's a local issue in your community or a local Assange chapter in your community. It's the same process. And so I really urge people to check out that school, How Social Transformation Occurs. I think it really will help everyone who wants to be a more effective advocate for any cause to go through that school and really learn, because there's a long history. None of us we are all learning. Movements have existed for a long time. There have been great activists throughout history in the U.S. and around the world, and we can learn from all of them. And so we try to do that, and that school is our effort to help people answer the question you're asking. I hope that helps a little bit.
Well, and actually, Steve and Andrew and the rest of the Action for Assange crew, they've been working on teach-ins, and I'm really excited for those to come out too. But I also kind of wanted to touch on our good friend Rob in the chat asked how both of you guys, what your reaction was to the forcible removal of Assange. Was it something that you were surprised by? Were you kind of expecting it on some level? Just can you kind of, sort of put into words, if you can, what your gut reaction was when that happened?
I'll let Danny go first on this one.
I was surprised in the moment rather than surprised by the eventuality, if that makes sense. In the end, force is the tool that any government is going to use. They'll attempt other things. Usually it's social ostracization, character assassination, whatever it takes, blackmail. But in the end, I think this was symptomatic of empire and its broad tentacles. You were talking, Kevin, about the movements and how do we organize. And I'm a neophyte. I'm just like kind of learning this stuff. But one of the things I've noticed in these veterans groups is that we've started to be sort of, intersectional. And I know that that's the word the kids love, and I'm getting used to it, right? I'm learning the lingo, and it's important stuff. And so we always talk about how, okay, there's empire abroad that we were all in, and there's empire at home, and that's the police and the MRAPs in small towns in Indiana. But I think another aspect of that is it also boomerangs overseas with our allies and minions over there. And so I definitely saw the forcible entry in one sense as like the special relationship that we always talk about with London and Washington, really the dark side of it, right? Yep. Turning on its head. And so, yeah, I allowed myself to be surprised, right? In the moment, like, wow, okay, this is really happening. But in the end, the standoff wasn't going to last forever, and they will move to force when everything else fails. Sometimes that'll be their first lead, but this time I guess they waited. You probably have a little more inside take on that, though.
Well, I agree. That's a really great description about surprised at the moment, but not surprised at the event in the long run, because that it's inevitable. It's going to end. At some point, the government is going to say, we're not taking this anymore. I want to comment on the word intersectional, because I think that's a really important concept, and I think it really applies to the Assange movement. What we talk about in our efforts to build movements is to create a movement of movements. In other words, bringing the various movements together rather than being stuck in a silo working on a narrow issue, let's say abortion or something, or a narrow issue, even a narrow issue of racism, of police violence. Instead, linking all these issues. And what's very powerful about the Assange situation is when you talk about freedom of the press and a democratized media, that is critical to every issue. If we have a democratized media where the people's voice is heard, that is a power shifting change. If the people can get our message out, it's very powerful. And I think one way you do that is to create a movement of movements, to show people how various issues link together. I know in some of our most successful campaigns, for example, we were involved in a campaign to stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was this massive corporate trade deal Obama was negotiating in secret with 600 corporate advisors, but no one else allowed to know about it. The trade czar, the head of the U.S. trade representative, he said that the reason they kept it secret was because if anybody knew about what was in it, it would never pass. I mean, how democratic is that? If anyone knew about it, it wouldn't pass. But what we did was we started to educate people about this trade agreement. We got the word out about it. So education is the first step. Then we started to organize people by letting different movements know how to affect it, how to affect workers, how to affect the environment, how to affect healthcare and pharmaceuticals, how to affect inequality, how to affect military budgets, how to affect secrecy and intelligence. I mean, every aspect of life was in this massive trade agreement. And so it went from ignorance about it to a large coalition opposing it, to the point where no politician could support it any longer. Rob Porter, who's the senator from Ohio, he was the former U.S. trade representative for George Bush. So he was the trade czar for George Bush. He came out against it. Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State when this is being negotiated, she came out against it. Everybody came out against it because they had no choice. The movement of movements came together and created a situation where we could not be ignored. And that's, I think, what this general strike is about, by the way. That's what's going to happen with this general strike. It affects every aspect of life. The inequality in the economy, the inadequate health care, the shutting down the economy, the COVID crisis, how mishandled it was. It affects every aspect of our life. And so we're going to bring a movement of movements together behind this general strike. It's going to become changes the political narrative. And so I just wanted to tee off on that point you made, Danny, about intersectionality, because that's to me what intersectionality means. It means bringing people together who think they have different interests and realizing that they all have the same interests. And I think Assange can be a great focal point for that, because it really, free press and the way he's being mistreated affects all of us. And that's what we have to get across.
Ultimately, the core of what we were trying to do when we went to D.C. during the first week of extradition, we ended up carrying around a WikiLeaks flag. And we would have people from all walks of the political spectrum sign the flag, because it's a symbol of a post-partisan conversation. If we can agree on one thing, we can agree to the unencumbered proliferation of information without spin, without someone trying to tell you how you have to think about it, then we can talk about all the issues that affect us. But if we're not having an honest dialogue, we don't need to have a dialogue in the first place, because it's just going to get wrapped up in the manufactured confusion that we get from the legacy or corporate media every day.
If I could just jump in real quick, building on both your points, I do think that Assange is sort of perfect for this intersectional discussion, because, as you mentioned, different people from different political walks of life signing that flag. How many other issues are there than this free press issue, where Marxists and paleo-libertarians are on the same, right? I write for both of them, It's one of the few issues where it's like this could work, and there's a few others. And I think that it's, I may not agree with the other side, but hey, we're going to stand together on this. And that shows you that it's an important, really a profound issue when that happens. Because in this time, it just doesn't happen. I mean, it's so rare.
And on this flag, Danny, we've got Michael Flynn Jr.
Oh,
as
wow.
well as Medea Benjamin. We've got Lee Camp and Cassandra Fairbanks. Like
Yeah.
Like it would be hard to get all of these people into a room together, but at least on the flag, there's a statement of intent that we can have a post-partisan reality, really. And that's what we're trying to drive home here. It's what I tried to drive home on my other show, Slow News Day. Like we can do all of these things in a post-partisan fashion, but we've got to get the free press right first.
Well, your point you made it when you first talked about the flag, you used the word truth. I think that is so important for the Assange case because we are very lucky when we advocate for Assange that truth is on our side. He never published anything false. And the truth about our military behavior in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Guantanamo prison, the State Department, the Democratic Party, the DNC, all these truths are truths people want to know. And they want to know the truth. They want to know the reality of their government. And so, we are able to come at this with the most important power, which is credibility. We don't have to lie to people. We can tell people the truth. And so when you start from that point, that is a very key organizing tool. You're educating people, telling them what's really happening, and you're organizing them around the truth. Then you're mobilizing them to protect the truth. That's a very powerful force.
As Julian says, if wars can be started by lies, then peace can be started by truth.
That's right.
He's absolutely right.
And there's always that. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. Go ahead.
I'd say there's always that discussion with, WikiLeaks, like, oh, the government. So you've got truth on one end. Look, this is real. This is data. These are documents. And then the government really responds to that with obfuscation and, unbacked assertion. And it's always, oh, it got people killed. And I'll just counter that with a very brief point. I would argue that journalism of the Assange variety, unvarnished journalism, has the potential to save lives. And everyone loves
That's right. That's right.
But I'm talking about not just the troops. I'm talking about innocent civilians.
That's right.
If WikiLeaks had got their hands on the Afghanistan papers rather than the Washington Post, they'd have been released years earlier. And if we found out that the generals had been lying the whole time, maybe that war ends a little earlier. Maybe it doesn't, but maybe it does. And that would have saved tens of thousands of lives. So I just reject this whole idea of, it got people killed, but we can't tell you how. We can't show any evidence. I mean, that's Orwellian.
And more to that
I think
point,
WikiLeaks has already saved lives.
In Chelsea Manning's court-martial hearing, it was one of the people representing the U.S. military said on record, no one was put in harm's way as a result of these.
That's right. That's right.
Not something that I just had to have that conversation on Twitter this morning. It was one of the first things that I did when I woke up because I saw someone saying, well, didn't it put people in harm's way? No, and as a matter of fact, we have proof it doesn't. Before we close out the interview segment for the evening, yesterday marked the 9th anniversary of the release of the Gitmo files by WikiLeaks. And this was one of the more brutal document drops, not only because it underscored Barack Obama can't keep a promise to a voter. He can keep a promise to a CEO, but he can't keep a promise to a voter. And B, it included the names of children who had been caught up in all of this. And it was one of the very first times in media, at least in terms of Iraq war or the Afghan war, where you had solid proof that children's lives were being ridiculously impacted by this. I just want to kind of get your sentiment on the fact that we still have an open and operating Gitmo, Danny, and then we can go from there.
Well, I think that a story that just slipped through the news cycle a few months back, as things tend to do in the mainstream, was that the military has brought hospice care to Guantanamo. Okay. What does that tell us, right? Well, no matter what the rhetoric says, the actions sometimes speak for themselves. And the actions in this case mean what we all knew, but no one wanted to say. Those folks are going to die there. That's the plan, right? Or at least a number of them. In some ways, I think I can't help but bring out the Dostoevsky platitudes, right, about the degree of civilization in a society by looking at its prisons. Well, I would say the degree of civilization in a society looks even worse if the prisons are offshored to, essentially non-extradition locations in the absence of law, crafted in that way. It really is shocking. And it is important to remember, of course, that while Obama didn't open Guantanamo and it wasn't only his failure to close it, this is Saint Barack of Espionage Act, okay, as I like to call him. That would be his Catholic saint name, right? So this is a guy who, prosecutes more people under the Espionage Act, this archaic World War I thing, than all the other presidents combined. And he doesn't close Guantanamo, and, we're bombing 7 countries a day instead of 2 by the time he leaves. This is really important to keep in mind. I think that what's most disturbing about the Guantanamo issue for me is I'm at a loss, and I hope you guys have an answer or better answers. I'm at a loss to how do I make most American people care about those, several dozen folks that are still there who are so easily labeled as other, brown, Muslim, or terrorist. How in the world do we build empathy for these folks who I really believe reflect on what's left of the Republic, right? Because they are kind of like a mirror to the rest of us. But it's very difficult to do, and I'm sometimes at a loss for that.
I think we have a really big chance, just to jump in, because this is something I was thinking of earlier, with the Kevin's point with the general strike. So many things are just not adding up right now. And I've seen it quite a bit. People saying, wait a minute, we have, $750 billion to spend on the military, but yet we can't do anything to help the people through this crisis, through a forced, stay-at-home orders and things like that. But I mean, and sure, we keep people safe, but what's going to happen afterwards? So I think that's, maybe that is a big opportunity. I hate to say it, that it comes home a little bit, but it seems really naive to think that, our government is going to be doing all of these things abroad and they're not going to be happening at home. So I hope that this is kind of an awakening for people on a massive scale, because certainly our military budget has a lot to do with not having, not spending money domestically.
Well, and another question that Rob in our chat had for Danny and Kevin is, he wants to know kind of how do you guys think it's possible for us to maybe take down the war criminals without causing more war, more issues, more violence in the world? Do you guys have any ideas or thoughts about how we can maybe go about doing that?
Well, I think that question, and I think the comments on Guantanamo and Kendra's comments about the military budget, they all kind of point to me toward that same direction of U.S. gangsterism around the world is being exposed, U.S. lawlessness around the world and in Guantanamo is being exposed. We're seeing it at home with the incredible prison population that we have in the United States. And if there's one person, by the way, who had credit with that, is Joe Biden. He was the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee and the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the 80s and 90s when these mandatory sentencings were put in place. He just has a terrible record. And for that alone, he shouldn't be running for president. But we are a lawless country. And I saw it in the prosecution that we faced when we were in a courtroom and the jury's told Juan Guaido is president. It's like a Lewis Carroll novel, Alice in Wonderland. It's just like, what? Juan Guaido is president? He's never had one day in the White House. They call it the White House in Venezuela as well. I mean, it's like we are living in, and you can see the fear of U.S. leadership being held accountable. The International Criminal Court is already being asked to investigate the United States over its war crimes in Afghanistan. They're being asked to investigate the 51st state, Israel, over their treatment of the Palestinians. And in response to that, the U.S. threatens the ICC with sanctions. They are afraid of being held accountable. They know they are war criminals. They know
And they
they're
go
committing
as far as to threaten the family members of the people on the International Criminal Court.
That's right. That's right. It's like, it's such gangsterism. It's such mob behavior. And the world is seeing it. So there is going to be a day of accountability. It is coming. And I really do think that the question that you had from the audience about how do we hold people accountable, the rule of law has to be built up, because the rules of war are barbaric and don't work. They cause more harm than good. And people see that. And the only way to solve that problem is to put something in its place, and that's the rule of law. And, you know, we're able to do all sorts of conflict resolution. We're able to do all sorts of litigation to resolve problems, all sorts of arbitration to solve problems, and if necessary, holding people accountability for violation of law. That is what we have to build up. So I think while there may be some conflicts in getting there, the rule of law is the answer to how to hold these war criminals accountable, and it's how to reduce the military budget, move away from militarism, and the U.S. becoming not a military superpower, but a humanitarian superpower. We have shown our failure in this COVID crisis as a humanitarian superpower. We are stealing other countries' medical supplies. We're trying to steal research being done on health on healthcare solutions to the crisis. I mean, it's just incredible gangster, and the world is seeing it. So our leaders will be held accountable, and it's our job in the United States to demand that our leaders be held accountable. That is one of our jobs, and so it's coming. And I think that Kendra's right. There's a lot of right now opportunity because people are seeing all these fault lines and they're exploding. And so this general strike is one tool to move us in that direction.
Just to build briefly on that, I love that you brought up the ICC and the investigation in Afghanistan. It's important to remember, as I think you really mentioned, that we are a rogue state. Only a rogue state would pull the passport of an ICC investigator simply because she's going to open an official investigation, open one, and that it's going to look at all three sides, not just the United States. It's not targeted just the United States. It's going to look at the Afghan allies and the Taliban. And only a rogue state, I keep hearing about North Korea and Iran, all these other rogue states, but only a rogue state would pass in 2002 and a president sign a piece of legislation that is still law that is nicknamed appropriately the Hague Invasion Act, which kind of speaks to what was mentioned earlier, whereby if an American soldier or otherwise is ever held in the ICC, which we're not even party to, that the president doesn't need to go back to Congress. He is already authorized, preemptively authorized to use force up to and including military invasion of The Hague, right, in Europe, to bust them out in another piece of vigilante justice. This is shocking, and I agree, though, in terms of solutions. Okay, so there's the problem. Solutions, though, I agree that we need to start at sort of the top with accountability. There's all these arguments about guys like Eddie Gallagher, the Navy SEAL, who Trump pardoned, right? Probable war criminal, definitely guilty of some lower level crimes. I think guilty of the whole thing. I wouldn't like to spend 8 minutes in an elevator with him, but the issue to me is higher, right? It's the main crime, as the Nuremberg principles called it, which was aggression in general, state aggression. So to me, it's like, okay, let's aim high in terms of accountability from now on. Let's start there and then roll downward, rather than putting a few sergeants in Abu Ghraib in prison and then excusing everybody up and down the chain. Let's invert that, right? Where, they say crap rolls downhill in the military or in government. Okay, let's invert that for a moment. And I agree that accountability is key. Until people are held actually responsible, and this is one of the things Obama didn't do when he said we got to move on. If people are held responsible, there will be no change. There will be no change. We will have a polite emperor like Obama who will be, who will succeed a buffoonish emperor like Bush, who will then be, succeeded by a coarse emperor like Trump. But in the end, you're going to get the same thing until there's real accountability.
I think really the only way that we can end this chapter of the dark American history that we're in is with fully transparent, open, the whole public has access to all the documents and information, war trials and tribunals against these people. And that may seem like a far off long shot, but I don't see us being able to build the society that we imagine without having the first act be what we want that society to function like.
Wow, great point.
But this kind of transitions us into talking about the specific things that should be charged, which is the detention of children in Guantanamo Bay as a perfect example. If we could get those slides pulled up. This article is hosted on WikiLeaks, and it's from June 15th, 2011. It's called WikiLeaks and the 22 Children of Guantanamo. And it starts off on in May 2008, its submission from the 48th session of the UN Committee on the Rights of Children. The Pentagon claimed that it had only held 8 juveniles under the age of 18 for their alleged crimes that took place during the life of Guantanamo Bay Prison. This, however, was a lie, as its own documents provide the names and birth dates of prisoners released in May 2008. It showed the total was much higher. In November 2008, the UC Davis Center for the Study of Human Rights in the Americas published a report, Guantanamo Bay Children, Military and Diplomatic Testimonies, presenting evidence of 12 juveniles that had been held, and it's officially acknowledged by the Pentagon. If we can get the second slide up, it continues later. Just 3 of these former children prisoners are still held, but the U.S. Position has always been a disgrace. Notoriously, in May 2003, when the first story broke of a juvenile prisoner held at Guantanamo Bay, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld told a press conference, the constant refrain of the juveniles, as though there have been hundreds of children in there. These are not children, said General Richard Myers, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I would say, despite the age, these are very, very dangerous people. They have been that way, vetted many times in Afghanistan, and gone through a thorough process to determine what involvement was. Some have killed, some have stated that they were going to kill again. So they may be juveniles, but they are not in the little league anymore. They are in the major league teams. It's a terrorist team. They are in Guantanamo Bay for a very good reason, for our safety, for your safety. And then if we could just scroll through, because it shows the names of the 22 children that had been confirmed by WikiLeaks. And the ages range everywhere from about 15 years old to 16 and 17, and as low as 13 and 14 years of age when they entered Guantanamo Bay. I was wondering, and there is 6 others that they can't verify the ages, but at the time of detention may have been under the age of 18. I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts about why this didn't create more of a sensation and more of a stir across literally every political ideology, activist circle, and why it's still allowed to be open with almost no public pushback.
Can I just jump in just to go first? Because as I was listening to General Myers' quote that you were reading, General Myers was just this banal, just awful chairman of the Joint Chiefs who was in that position because he didn't question Rumsfeld. He spoke at my West Point graduation. But when I heard what you said there, where you said, these are not children, you know, they may look like children, but they're not. They're evil. They're uniquely evil. All I could think of, thinking of Joe Biden, thinking of the Clintons, super predators, right? I was thinking of that same language, that same dehumanization of the other, you know, terrorists, you know, or Muslims or Afghans in general. Their children aren't real children. They're almost like super predators. And that really jumped out at me. And why should we be surprised to a certain extent that the military would hold juveniles, whether it's at Bagram or Guantanamo? When was it that the Supreme Court finally said that Florida, in the Graham case, can't put children to death or give them life in prison without parole for crimes they committed when they were like 13 and 14? That was recently. You know, this is a country that's locked up its own children, that's labeled its own primarily African-American youth as super predators at one time. And one of those guys is running for president, and he might win. And I think this is part of why this slipped through the media like it often does, because, as I mentioned earlier, I do think that there's hope out there. I do think that there are things about this moment that have silver linings. But there is a massive empathy gap in the United States based on skin color and religion. And the just one tiny way to know it: if 14 Belgians are killed in a terror attack, and it is tragic, every white face is on that screen and accounted for. And when 144 Turks are killed in a terrorist attack by the same organization the same week, it might make the Chiron, and it says about 140. This is an empathy gap, and so it doesn't particularly surprise me that this would kind of get lost, and we wouldn't get a lot of attention for juveniles being held in Guantanamo.
You know, I think it's very hard for the people of the United States to look in the mirror and see what their country is. The truth of what the United States is a very ugly picture. And I know, you know, that's that kind of a phrase, that kind of a comment could be taken out of context and make me look like a U.S. hater. But what I'm really trying to say is that we have like Danny says, you know, there's a race part to this, and that goes back to the founding of the country. If you look at George Washington's orders on what to do to the indigenous peoples, it's just grotesque. You know, burn down all their teepees, kill their women and children, make sure no one lives. That's his orders. War criminal orders from the president who became our first president. If you look at the treatment of Africans as they were brought as property from Africa as slaves, just brutal. Can we look at that and face it honestly? Can we look at the reality of Guantanamo and face it honestly? It's an indictment of so many important parts of our country. It's an indictment of the military. People who were rounded up and brought to Guantanamo, many were not criminals. They were not hardened criminals. They weren't even criminals at all. You know, the few that had trials, there was almost no evidence of crimes. It's an indictment of our court system, an indictment of our military, an indictment of our government, and it's an indictment of ourselves. So I think, and it really shows why the work of someone like Julian Assange is so important, because getting out the truth about Guantanamo is very hard to do in the corporate media. They don't want to report on that. They're all complicit. They were complicit in the weapons of mass destruction and the 9/11 stories and the, you know, beating the chests to go to get revenge. I mean, the media is complicit, so they're not going to report on this. This escaped public notice because the media is part of it, the government's part, the elected government, the military government, the court system are all complicit. And so no one wants this to be seen. And so, you know, when you talked earlier about how we're going to get out of this by having a transparent examination of the actions of the United States, I agree with you. And that's when the documents released by WikiLeaks become so, when there is that transparent examination and holding people accountable, those WikiLeaks documents will be part of the evidence. And so that's what makes Assange so important. You know, it comes back to Assange again. Transparency is not something that the government, the media, the military wants to see. It's not something that most people in the United States want to see. They don't really want to see the truth about what we are when we look in the mirror, because it's a pretty ugly sight.
Well, this is a very monumental point you're making right here, Kevin. We as Americans, almost as a rule, don't know our own history. And we're certainly not taught it in primary school. We're certainly not taught it, you know, in high school. And even at the university level, you've got to specialize in individual branches of history if you really want to understand a non-whitewashed version of it. That's like a 3-hour conversation in and of itself. And we do have to move on to news. So gentlemen, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us. If we could get some final thoughts from the both of you, and if you could please let the folks who are watching know where they can find you. And Danny, by the way, I do have another show called Slow News Day, and I would love to have you on for an extended conversation about all this. Kevin, too, you're welcome on at any time. But I'd like to follow up with both of you after the fact. But yeah, let the folks know what where to find you and what your closing thoughts are, please. And thank you very much for being here with us tonight. This was an incredible conversation.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I really think that when I first came out, in solidarity with Julian Assange and called my first article "A Soldier's Defense," right? A soldier's defense. That got a lot of heat. I mean, I probably lost friends on that, and that's okay. It is what it is. But I really believe that all the thanks and all the adulation that's given to soldiers, and I don't want to just be pigeonholed as that. I mean, I do all kinds of work, but that is where I came from, and that's what started me. The worst thing that you can do to soldiers isn't spit on them or all this mythologizing of how all the veterans were treated after Vietnam. No, ignoring us and ignoring our wars is the worst. That's the greatest crime. And the beauty of what Assange did and what Chelsea Manning did was not to do that. Right. So I would prefer someone disagree with me. I would prefer someone bring the dirty laundry outside of my organization, but bring the truth and give a damn rather than what the usual stance of the American people and definitely of government is, which is to ignore these problems. So I'm with that slave-owning hypocrite, right, who said that if it comes down to newspapers or government, essentially, like I'm with the press. And I agree with that. So thanks for having me. This has been awesome. I learned a lot, and that's awesome.
So Danny actually is our articles now appear on Popular Resistance, so you can find Danny on Popular Resistance sometimes. So we're one of the places where he writes, and we're also going to be starting to air his podcast. If you want to follow Danny, follow Popular Resistance. And that's also
sorry. Yeah. Popular Resistance, weekly columns at antiwar.com. But best way to find my stuff, skepticalvet.com. All my stuff comes together there. Thanks.
Fantastic. Yeah, so Popular Resistance is my hub. We have lots of different campaigns that come off of that. I mentioned the general strike, the healthcare work, and we're doing advocacy for national improved Medicare for all, trade issues. I mean, a whole range of stuff we do campaigns from on Popular Resistance, but it's mainly a daily news reporting site. And it's educate and organize and mobilize people. That's what we try to do on Popular Resistance. And so you can find me there. And I hope that people subscribe to the Daily Digest, which is you can every day get a summary of news in your email box, and we do a weekly news analysis in our newsletter. And I please urge people to check the most recent 5 or 6 newsletters out, because Margaret and I have gone through a whole series of stories on this next decade being a decade of social transformation, and what we can do to get there, what we can do in the 2020 election with the terrible choice of Biden and Trump, how we can still turn that into a year of building people's power, because there's a history of how movements work and how they grow, even in this corporate duopoly of 2 parties that don't represent the people. And then the general strike, get involved in it. So check out those last 5 or 6 newsletters. I think you'll get a lot of information. And I really appreciate you guys are all well informed. It's good to talk to people who are on top of things, and so we can have an intelligent conversation. And I love Danny's work, so it's great to be on with Danny as well. So and I really appreciate you all doing the work on Julian Assange, because they really successfully character assassinated him, and he's a person who should be a hero, not someone who should be being prosecuted and brought to the United States for a show trial. So I hope we can all prevent that from happening and free Assange and free the truth. So thanks for having me on.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
All right. And so as we go into news, we did mention at the top of the show that the extradition hearing for Julian Assange that was scheduled to take place May 18th through July 5th has been postponed maybe sort of indefinitely. There's target dates of maybe July or maybe November. But our friends over at Consortium News had a pretty concise write-up on it. So if we could pull that, please, Josh. And I will start breaking it down. Magistrate Vanessa Barraster proposed postponing Julian Assange's extradition hearing until either 3 non-consecutive weeks in July and August or 3 consecutive weeks in November because of the difficulties proposed by the coronavirus outbreak. Barraster on Monday adjourned a technical hearing until May 4th, at which time a decision will be made on when the full hearing will resume. Assange's lawyers had submitted a petition to delay the hearing, originally scheduled to resume on May 18th because of the difficulties of consulting with Assange and of him having appeared either in the courtroom or by video link because of unsafe conditions in Belmarsh Prison's video room. This is something that I'm going to pause here for a moment. We know already, before any of this took place, the conditions inside the video link room weren't necessarily the most sanitary on the planet. We knew what an ordeal it's been just to get Julian to the video link room, which is housed in the same building, what he's had to go through in order for that to happen. We also know that once again, Vanessa Barraster came to court with a prepared statement. So this is example after example after example of her having a decision made before even consulting or hearing out the defense. Let's see if there's any pertinent bits in here. Though she said an adjournment for 3 weeks beginning either in July or November 2nd would be a significant delay, and that the interests of justice must be meted out expeditiously, Barraster conceded that the problems presented by the coronavirus lockdown in London made it at best uncertain to resume on May 18th, saying that the hearing should be vacated till a later date. What is important in this, and it's the line above what I just read, so yay me, Barraster said that though witnesses could appear via video, the defendant and lawyers must be physically present in the courtroom. So this is the magistrate saying, I don't really have any regard for the life of Julian Assange. I don't have any regard for his health. I don't have any regard for his safety. What is making the determining factor in my decision is whether or not counsel will be present in the room. So that to me is way more on brand for Vanessa Barraster than any sort of perception of humanity in terms of how Julian Assange is being treated. I would like to throw this over to my co-host. Anyone jump in?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I think that it's been obvious for a while that they don't give a shit about Julian Assange. I don't think anybody's surprised by that. I think they would honestly love for the coronavirus to do their dirty work for them. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, so yeah, I think this has all kind of been a show trial from the get-go. I don't really know. I mean, I feel really bad because I get DMs all the time from people who are like, you're so negative, but it doesn't look great, y'all. Like, let's be real. It doesn't look great. I mean, the judge is a nightmare, and the whole situation is just not great. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves about that if we are going to, actually deal with it. You can't deal with what you don't acknowledge. So, I mean, yeah, I agree with you.
I'm not saying this because I came up with the phrase. I'm saying it because it's true. I think we really need to start referring to Vanessa Barraster as a concierge for the State Department, because that's her primary function at this point.
Well, and I think, sorry, yeah, I was just going to say, I think one thing too, to your point as well about not being, being called that you're not being positive. It's like, well, exactly. It's time to be angry about this, because this is not just like Steve's point to having things already written out. That's not just against Julian Assange. That's against justice. That's against all of us. Like, to just spit in the face of even, listening to something, or even back to what our guests were talking about, of where, you know, things are just being done so blatant and out in the open, you know, that's against all of us as well.
It really, with the current situation we're in, harkens back, and I know I say this a lot, but the saying that they weren't after Julian Assange, they were after us, and he was just in their way. Julian Assange is in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. The times that he does get to get out, he gets 1 hour of recreation. A lot of times he doesn't even get the phone call that they allow him to have, but he still can call out from time to time in prearranged circumstances. And even with that, that requires a physical escort to a phone that's been used by multiple other people in a prison where multiple people have already died of coronavirus. So he's in this situation where they're not even allowing him to meet face to face with his lawyers. He has to use a video link that almost guarantees the fact that it's going to be surveilled and those private conversations aren't going to be private. So to me, it feels like they're trying to prolong this torture where they're going to say, hey, you know, it's going to be another 4 months before the U.S. gets to skirt you away because we have the power to hold you here, because we're not releasing you because you're still on remand.
Well, and it was confirmed too, I think in one of the threads that I can't remember which thread it was, maybe a couple of them even, that were there reporting that he wasn't there for this hearing because he was ill already, you know, ill again, not able to show up. I mean, that's a big deal. It's not, you know, being that sick to not be able to come to your own hearing. That's a big deal. So I think that's important too, that we keep that in mind, that his health is already extremely poor after, you know, almost a decade really of this psychological torture, and then only intensified this past year.
And again, can't stress this enough. The only reason he is in Belmarsh prison right now is because he's a political prisoner on remand. The British government's official position on whether or not to let him out during this COVID pandemic is, well, we can't because we haven't actually charged him with anything yet. If that's not insanity to the people who are watching this, I invite you to prove to me what is.
That is insane. I think I talked about this last time I was on. The fact that their whole excuse for him not being able to be released is that he hasn't been charged with anything. That's the most backwards thing I've ever heard. That's exactly why he should be released. It's insanity. And I think at one point they tried to say that he's a flight risk. Where's he going to go? The whole world's on lockdown. It's complete ridiculousness. And I mean, it's just another piece of the show trial. It's another piece of the whole kabuki theater of everything that they're doing right now. It's all complete insanity. And it makes me angry that more people, I mean, and I get that the propaganda game is strong and that a lot of people don't really even have any idea what's going on. But I mean, when I see people on the left who, you know, claim to care about these things, not say a goddamn word about it, it's so frustrating to me. We're shooting ourselves in our own foot repeatedly over and over again. This always comes back on the left. It's not like we don't have historical references for this. This is always going to be something that comes back on the left. And the very idea that, you know, top progressive leaders are dead silent is unbelievably infuriating to me. Sorry, I don't know why I went on that rant.
Well, the Espionage Act in and of itself was designed to help curtail the power of left-wing movements. One of the first people tried under the Espionage Act was Eugene Debs, who was a famous and or infamous union organizer, depending on your political ideology. But literally one of the first major historical amendments to the First Amendment was the fact that Eugene Debs gave a speech calling for people not to enlist in the military. And that you encouraging people not to enlist in the military is actually a violation of the Espionage Act. And most people don't even know that that's a curtailment to the First Amendment is, well, you can't speak bad about the military or ask people to not join. So the fact that it was originally used against anti-war organizers when it was founded to today being used against information organizers and journalists and activists and whistleblowers is not that it's a surprise even, because you just see the progression of how it was used throughout history and the way that they build legal precedent on top of legal precedent, where they postulated using these laws against Ellsberg during the Pentagon Papers, but it wasn't really until the Barack Obama era where whistleblowers were prosecuted super heavily, and then journalists, Julian, essentially laying the foundational groundwork for any journalist anywhere in the world that reports on accurate information gets taken to the U.S. and put in these prisons that they tried to expose.
Well, and not only, also to build off of Misty's point, even on the right, there were so many independent people leading up to Trump's election that were, that was their MO about the media's lying, the media this, the media that, and even Trump with his fake news, and then here's something real happens and you don't, it's just crickets there. So it's just really, it's on both sides of things that you see things.
Well, let's move on to our next article here. We've got one of friend of the show, Mohammed El-Mazi's pieces out of Sputnik. Mo, of course, was present for the hearing, and has really been an invaluable resource throughout this. Misty, do you want to go ahead and take this article, please?
Oh, yeah, I can totally do that. Let me see here. I don't have it pulled up.
Oh. Well, I do then. You can take the next one.
Okay.
So, as he often does, Mo grabs a couple of interviews outside the courtroom. This one was with British historian and author John Rees. He's one of the founding facilitators of the Don't Extradite Assange campaign. And the question Mo put to him was, what is your initial reaction to the judge's decision regarding part 2 of Assange's hearing? And Rees answers, I'm glad that it happened. Previously, as you'll know, she wanted to stick to the 18th May date for the second part of the trial. She was almost obsessively determined to start on that date. It's now clear that it is absolutely impossible under the current circumstances. The defense lawyers, Julian Assange's lawyers, and the prosecution lawyers agreed that was the case. And so the judge was left with very little choice but to agree to a postponement. Here then we've got the really a substantive answer from Rees to the question, what do you think Judge Verheyster's refusal to lend any meaningful weight to the fact that the lawyers continue to have problems in accessing their client properly? And this, of course, relates to the fact that there is hardly any communication between a man facing extradition to 175 years in a black fucking hole and his legal team. Rees says, well, I think that's an important point. She has, throughout the entirety of these hearings, been absolutely unwilling to intervene to make sure that the lawyers have access to their client. She continually, in the hearing today and in previous hearings, says that it's up to the prison authorities. She said today that the prison authorities say it's safe. It doesn't matter that Julian Assange has had an independent medical advice telling him not to go through the prison, not to use the video room. You might at least think that she would inquire on what basis the prison authorities think it's safe. There's a prison authority which has had 2 prisoners die in its custody. I mean, who knows whether or not they told the relatives or the prisoners themselves they were safe the day before they lost their lives. So what the prison authorities' advice is worth on the safety of their prisoners isn't quite clear. Neither is it clear that the judge knows on what grounds that advice was given. Does she know that the video room is sanitized between each prisoner using it? Does she know whether or not the corridor is sanitized before people move through them? I doubt that she even knows, and I further doubt whether that's true. So I think it's completely irresponsible on the judge's part. I think she would have a responsibility for whether or not it was a fair trial in her courtroom, and there can't be a fair trial with this level of access between lawyer and client. We can kill that page right now because it's kind of an ancillary question. But these are some real, not just in terms of how it applies to Julian Assange, but in how it applies to all of us who have to move around throughout this pandemic. Very, very reasonable asks and very reasonable concerns. The idea that we're all supposed to be wearing masks because that keeps us safe, but everybody walks into a grocery store and touches the same shit on every aisle. Nobody is following customers around, sanitizing everything that's being touched. It's the placebo of the mask is, to me, a sign of the public's willingness to conform. Now, as that applies to Julian Assange, not so much, but it does raise a larger point, and I was wondering what y'all thought about that.
I think one thing that I was thinking about with the, just constant, oh, well, that's the prison's responsibility. Oh, no, that's so-and-so's responsibility. Oh, no, we can't, it's like being, you've got free press of the world's free press on the line. And it's like, the intelligence of and I don't mean to insult them, but it's like being on the phone with CenturyLink or something, trying to get your internet on, and you're being, you know what I mean, put to like this person and that person. And it's just so dumbed down and stupid and frustrating. And, these are really basic things for a court trial, for anybody's court trial, no matter what it is, a misdemeanor. I mean, whatever it might be that any person should have. And it's just so ridiculous. And to your point about the COVID seed, I do see, just what people are willing to accept, what people are willing to accept in the case of Julian Assange. A lot of people, one, just not knowing about it, but that there are free presses on the line, and, oh, that's okay because somewhere, somehow, he was dangerous and, he harmed a bunch of people and maybe he's a rapist, when here we are, we have two rapists basically running for president. So it's, it's just so ridiculous. Sometimes it's difficult. I don't know. I'll throw that back to you guys.
I think the irony of the entire situation as it stands in 2020 is that Julian Assange is an innocent man on all fronts. The rape accusations never turned into charges. It was something that gets pulled up to flaunt in the media. The blue checks on Twitter just aimlessly will smear him with the rapist charge, while at the same time completely ignore Tara Reade's claims that they ever existed against Joe Biden. And it's horrifying that a man that said, Joe Biden, that we should kill Julian Assange, is now running for president, while the media completely ignores the fact that this is an actual issue. And at the same time, the man that says, I love WikiLeaks, isn't turning this into a platform issue because it exposes his hypocrisy. It exposes the bullshit that he's trying to pull with the psychological operations, saying that he's coming to take out the deep state, when all he does is just continue to employ them and get rid of the members that don't support him, and makes the swamp to his own liking instead. Won't make it an issue, that man, because it's those people that should be in prison. It's the Donald Trumps, the Joe Bidens, the George Bushes, the Dick Cheneys, and all of their minions that built these institutions that should be in prison, while this man is celebrated for the fact that he gave us the information that showed us how our money was being used to make someone else profit.
And I think with that, we can go ahead and introduce our next article, which I believe this time Misty has up and is ready to go. That was my fault last time. I sort of jumped the gun on that. But yeah, I mean, this is going to open up a larger and little bit, different conversation than what we had with Kevin and Danny, but relevant to what this whole vigil is about in terms of surveillance and what we're being subjected to. There's a companion article out of The Atlantic that we're going to get to after this. But if you want to take a swing at that, please, Misty, go ahead.
Yeah, of course. This article is on raymcgovern.com for anybody who wants to check it out. I think Consortium News also published it. If I may be wrong, I don't know. But yeah, we'll go ahead and go through this. If you guys get bored with me, just tell me to shut the F up. Okay, so travesty is not a nice word. It usually is applied to gross perversions of justice, and that apparently is the context Attorney General William Barr desired when he dropped it into an interview answer the other day in the breezy courtyard of the Department of Justice. His composed, understated delivery almost disguised the weighty magnitude of that disturbing word and the loaded adjective that preceded it. I think what happened to him, he said, referring to the president and the FBI's counterintelligence investigation into his campaign, was one of the greatest travesties in American history. Okay, it's important to pause for a moment and absorb what the AG just said. He just called an FBI investigation not just a travesty, but one of the greatest travesties in the nation's history. It was an unprecedented statement by an attorney general about his own department's premier agency. The FBI has made plenty of mistakes, but never in its 112-year history has an FBI investigation been characterized as a travesty, let alone one that equates to other Hall of Fame travesties in American history. Is the AG's assessment fair? The answer is entwined in his next statement. Without any basis, the FBI started this investigation into Donald Trump's campaign. Oops, start right there. Stop again right there. Mr. Barr is making a definitive statement about that which many of us have speculated all along, namely that the weirdly unprecedented investigative team put together by former FBI Director James Comey and Deputy Director Andrew McCabe did not have an adequate legal reasons to open a case into the Trump campaign in the first place. The Attorney General just confirmed that. But wait a minute, doesn't that directly contradict DOJ Inspector General Michael Horowitz's assertion that the FBI's counterintelligence investigation was justified? Two things to keep in mind regarding that inconsistency. First, remember that IG Horowitz reached two primary and controversial conclusions. One, that there was adequate justification for starting the investigation, and two, that there was no evidence of political bias as a motivating factor for the investigation. He based his conclusions, according to his report, solely on his interviews with the FBI individuals who started and ran the case from Mr. Comey on down. That's our story, they all said, and we're sticking to it. This would be like an FBI agent interviewing four subjects suspected of robbing a bank after hearing their denials, concluding that there was no evidence they committed the crime. The IG is not a criminal investigator and certainly not steeped in counterintelligence matters. The Attorney General, on the other hand, owns the Attorney General guidelines that dictate what it takes to initiate an FBI investigation, particularly, God, that word always makes me feel like I'm drunk, particularly of an American citizen. He is the ultimate arbiter, which leads to the second point. The AG is logically being briefed on the progress and findings of the U.S. Attorney John Durham's investigation, which he commissioned to examine how the empty Russia collusion case got started in the first place and if it involved any wrongdoing on the part of the government. It is a safe bet that Mr. Durham is collecting evidence beyond the self-serving statements of the FBI principals involved. It also is now a safe bet that his findings will respectfully disagree with Mr. Horowitz. If anybody wants to jump in or tell me that I'm like reading too fast or annoying,
Yeah, no,
whatever.
I would love to comment on this, and you did awesome. I'm terribly dyslexic, so whenever you just fumble on one word compared to like every single word, it's pretty great.
I can read okay. I just generally tend to do it too fast, and I don't know. Go ahead.
So essentially, what this article is pointing out is that the Steele dossier, which turned into the FOIA indictments or investigations with the Foreign Intelligence Court, was bullshit. That the Trump campaign had been surveilled illegally for literally just the political benefit of the Democratic Party. That Hillary Clinton's campaign had essentially hired, more or less, these actors within the federal government, assuming that she would win and that no one would get caught and that this information would never come to light. That they had used the foreign intelligence courts to go after Carter Page and multiple other members of Trump's campaign simply and strictly to be able to listen into campaign strategies but also as a way to try to dig up more dirt to smear him with and to use against him. So if these investigations by Durham turn into a full-on criminal prosecution, this will be one of the actual first acts of government accountability in my lifetime.
Yeah, no, that's fair. It's totally fair. I think it's always important to remind people what a swamp monster William Barr is. This is a guy who ran obfuscation and tried to delay the church commission hearings in the 70s. This is a guy who was part and parcel of the cover-up of Iran-Contra, and ultimately being the one who made sure that the pardons went through under George H.W. Bush's administration when he was Attorney General then. Like, people, so there are a lot of people who aren't even aware of the fact that William Barr was already an Attorney General. And the recycling of these Reagan-Bush era neocon, treasonous, dirtbag gangster scumfucks that just won't go away. It's just more of an example that the Trump administration is not unique, not new, doesn't present an never before seen threat to the American public. It's just a continuation, another caretaker presidency of George H.W. Bush's maniacal CIA whims when he went from the office of the directorate to the vice presidency. William Barr has a pre-crime division, and we don't talk about that enough. If you guys remember last year, there were 2 mass shootings in the same relative time period, about a weekend. Donald Trump came out that Monday and said, we need the ability, law enforcement needs the ability to scour the deepest, darkest corners of the web to stop these crimes before they start. As of January 1st of this year, William Barr has that division within the Department of Justice and all of the branches of law enforcement that ultimately report to the Department of Justice. Pre-crime in an era where we have contact tracers. Pre-crime in an era where Apple and Google give your location data to the government in case you're not compliant in your social distancing protocols. Pre-crime in an era where the Earn It Act is about to make its way through Congress and kill end-to-end encryption for most of us. This is not a nice guy, not a good guy. And if you're one of those people who are watching the show right now who only watches Judicial Watch and Q, William Barr is not your friend.
Well, not to mention, I mean, what's the track record for this supposed technology that they're going to be able to tell before people can commit a crime? You know, I mean, look at the situation that we're in now. You know, they don't even, when did the virus start? When did this happen? When did, you know, I mean, they don't have a track record of being able to use technology to really our benefit at all in the first place, even with all of the surveillance. So it's really terrifying, and it's just a further tightening of the measures that we've seen, even, you know, starting with the Assange arrest, you know, these Orwellian things being put in place.
And we actually saw, so the Five Eyes, if people don't know, is an intelligence alliance between the US, Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia. All their laws are pretty much the same as far as intelligence gathering goes. If one of them passes a new law, the other ones are soon to follow, or already breaking that law that has yet to be put into place. And we saw, for one of the first times that I know of, I don't know if it was because of some type of pre-crime system, but there was an organizer in Australia that was working on immigrants' rights. And he was arrested 3 hours before the protest on an incitement charge. Literally went into his house, pulled him out, took his computer, took his son's computer. This was something that when we did our event with SORC Sydney, the Free Assange Sydney group, one of their active and organizing members had been talking about this. And the gentleman was literally getting a car protest together to go park outside of a hotel and honk and deliver services to the immigrant families that had been placed there as a form of detention, I believe. And that was one of the first, to my knowledge, pre-crime rollouts in a Five Eyes country, or uses of a system similar to that, where they target someone before a rally or protest had been engaged as it was leading up to it. So pulling this guy out of his house 2 or 3 hours before this protest started. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing stuff like that here in the US on both sides of the political ideologies protest spectrum. So whether you're someone fighting to end the lockdown and get the accurate information about the coronavirus, or you're someone fighting to start a general strike, these Orwellian, draconian lockdown measures and surveillance tactics and pre-crime divisions will be used specifically to target those kinds of people, which actually allows us to transition pretty nice into our next article with from the Atlantic. Do you want to pick that one up, Kendra? You're muted.
Okay, let's try that again. Okay, yeah, so this article from the Atlantic, internet speech will never go back to normal. In the debate over freedom versus control of the global network, China was largely correct and the US was wrong. So this is written by Jack Goldsmith, a Harvard law professor, and Andrew Keen Woods. And
let's be perfectly clear here real quick, though. Jack Goldsmith was part of the Bush administration. He's not just a tweed suit, Ivy educated professor. Like, he was inside the belly of the beast making policy decisions for Bushco.
Yeah, I had pulled that up. I was like, who are these guys? And, I found this just on a brief search. During Goldsmith's tenure at the Office of Legal Counsel, he wrote at least 2 legal memos authorizing a program known as Stellar Wind. His memo said that the president has inherent constitutional power in a time of war to monitor Americans' communications without warrant. So that's this guy. And then another interesting thing is the other author. Hold on, let me pull that up again. Sorry, I got to go back to the article. Andrew Keen Woods was has a Gates scholarship, or had a Gates scholarship. So I thought that very interesting. So if you guys don't want to go through this whole article yourselves, I would recommend reading Cato's article that described this perfectly as outrage porn, because that's exactly what it is. So COVID-19 has emboldened American tech platforms to emerge from their defensive crouch. Before the pandemic, they were targets of public outrage over life under their dominion. Today, the platforms are proudly collaborating with one another and following government guidance to censor harmful information related to the coronavirus. So that's pretty much anything that doesn't, fit the mainstream narrative. And they are using their prodigious data collection capacities in coordination with federal and state governments to improve contact tracing, quarantine enforcement, and other health measures. As Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg recently boasted, the world has faced pandemics before, but this time we have a new superpower, the ability to gather and share data for good. Do you guys want to make any comments on just that first part?
I think the Orwellian overtones in it are absolutely crazy. And the fact that there's even a comparison, really, between the US and China as far as tech policy and surveillance and censorship goes, because the US has proved that it doesn't even need law to censor the internet, where it has these giant institutions, Google, Twitter, Facebook, etc., that are more than willing to do the handiwork for politicians to be able to censor and remove articles and literally remove people from the internet for proliferating information it doesn't like.
Well, exactly. And we have absolutely no choice in this either. It's just happening. I'll keep going. Civil rights groups are tolerating these measures. Emergency times call for emergency measures, but are also urging a swift return to normal when the virus ebbs. We need to make sure that when we've made it past this crisis, our country isn't transformed into a place we don't want to live, warns the American Civil Liberties Union's Jay Stanley. Any extraordinary measures used to manage a specific crisis must not become permanent fixtures in the landscape of government intrusions into daily life, declares the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a digital rights group. These are real worries, since as the foundation notes, life-saving programs such as these and their intrusions on digital liberties tend to outlive their urgency. So I think this is there's one paragraph in here that just struck me. But the extraordinary measures we are seeing are not all that extraordinary. Powerful forces were pushing toward greater censorship and surveillance of digital networks long before the coronavirus jumped out of the wet markets in Wuhan, China, and they will continue to do so once the crisis passes. The practices that American tech platforms have undertaken during the pandemic represent not a break from prior developments, but an acceleration of them. As surprising as it may sound, digital surveillance and speech control in the United States already show many similarities to what one finds in authoritarian states such as China. Constitutional and cultural differences mean that the private sector, rather than the federal and state governments, currently takes the lead in these practices, which further values and address the threats different from those in China. But the trend toward greater surveillance and speech control here and toward the growing involvement of government is undeniable and likely inexorable. In the great debate of the past 2 decades about freedom versus control of the network, China was largely right and the United States was largely wrong. Significant monitoring and speech control are inevitable components of a mature and flourishing internet, and governments must play a large role in these practices to ensure that the internet is compatible with a society's norms and values. So I don't think we have to go through the whole rest of this article, but that paragraph right there is completely against our society's norms and values. It's just astounding to me. What do you guys think about that?
Well, this whole article, and Caitlin Johnston's right when she calls it outrage porn for any thinking, feeling, rational human being. But to the denizens of the national security apparatus, everything that China is doing and has done, that, as the article notes, we've mirrored in a lot of ways here, all of that is a good thing and a necessary thing. And the way they kind of dismiss and laugh off the ACLU and the Electronic Frontier Foundation is monstrous to me. There are some things in the article further down that I do want to touch on later on in the discussion, just because the way that it's framed in the Atlantic lets you know what kind of surveillance programs we're already under, what kind of track and trace programs are in existence. Except for in the Atlantic, they couch them all as like, oh, these are reasonable and necessary measures that any brutal totalitarian authoritarian regime would implement. That particular paragraph that you just read, though.
Can we just reread one sentence, please? Guys, listen to this. Again, significant monitoring and speech control are inevitable components of a mature and flourishing internet, and governments must play a large role in these practices to ensure that the internet is compatible with the society's norms and values. What the fuck is that? That's crazy, guys. You guys.
That was my exact reaction.
Holy cow. Like, I had to read that sentence probably a dozen times before my brain could process the absolute insanity that brings to the conversation. It just kind of boggles my mind that that's a real thing in the Atlantic. I guess it doesn't really boggle my mind, but it's terrifying. Am I wrong? That's terrifying. That's a terrifying sentence.
The constitutional and cultural differences means that the private sector, rather than the federal and state governments, currently takes the lead in these practices. So we're already under an authoritarian regime. It's just not in the way that most people picture what an authoritarian country looks like. Instead of having a government that dictates to everyone what needs to happen to continue its power, it's the opposite or antithesis almost, to where it is the people in power across political spectrums that implement these speech controls on private platforms that curtail the conversation. And it's
private platforms that got NQTEL funding, private platforms that get heavily subsidized, private platforms that are only private when it comes time to pay shareholders, but certainly not private when it comes time to regulate speech.
And we have I know we talk about this a lot, but it never gets enough news coverage. The counterintelligence strategy for 2020 through 2022, I'm going to read one quick line out of it. China and Russia operate globally and use all instruments of national power to target the United States and have a broad range of sophisticated intelligence capabilities. Other state adversaries such as Cuba, Iran, and North Korea, non-state actors such as Lebanese Hezbollah, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda, as well as transnational criminal organizations and ideologically motivated entities such as hacktivists, leaktivists, and public disclosure organizations also pose a significant threat. This is what they're going to be going after with these measures. They're going to be targeting the people that are leaktivists and public disclosure organizations, because what a public disclosure organization is an independent media outlet. It is the people trying to tell the world what is actually happening that aren't owned by the corporate state. So any directive that and power that they gain under the coronavirus will literally just be used in these counterintelligence strategies, which came out during the coronavirus.
That's so true. And one thing I was just thinking about too is that, through this, I mean, you just kind of see all of these things start to progress, or really regress into totalitarianism, with just kind of a different spin on it. And, and now we have articles that are full out, coming full out saying like, nope, yep, that's what we want. We should be like China. And there was one point in here too that I thought was really interesting that I wanted to read. Two events were wake-up calls. The first was Edward Snowden's revelations in 2013 about the astonishing extent of secret U.S. government monitoring of digital networks at home and abroad. The U.S. government's domestic surveillance is legally constrained, especially compared with what authoritarian states do. But this is much less true of private actors. Snowden's documents gave us a glimpse of the scale of surveillance of our lives by U.S. tech platforms and made plain how the government accessed privately collected data to serve its national security needs. I think that's very true. But when I first read it, it just kind of struck me that it was, just sort of giving the U.S. government an out on these things. And it's, what Snowden did is to release what was going on with both of these organizations. And then so the response of this article is like, yes, well, we need more of that. And we need them to unite together. It's just crazy.
This article seems to be advocating for like the tech companies to take control over all of this stuff. Like it's complete, like this the paragraph farther down, these constitutional limits help explain why, since the Russian electoral interference, digital platforms have taken the lead in combating all manner of unwanted speech on their networks, and if anything have increased their surveillance of our lives. But the government has been in the shadows of these developments, nudging them along and exploiting them when it can. And that, like, the fact that that's a thing, that our government is working with social media giants to monitor and surveil and control our access to information, ability to communicate online, is intense. Like, that's intense, you guys.
And there's one more section of this article that I want to highlight, and then we're a little bit over time already, so we're going to go ahead and close out after that. but it highlights how we're being censored. And when you hear a lot of us activists talk about, oh, Twitter's fucking with me or this is going on, like the inclination is to dismiss it because, you know, we're all crazy. But according to the article, after the 2016 election debacle, for example, the tech platforms took aggressive but still imperfect steps to fend off foreign adversaries. YouTube has an aggressive policy of removing what it deems to be deceptive practices and foreign interference operations related to elections. It also makes judgments about and gives priority to what it calls authoritative voices. Facebook has deployed a multi-pronged strategy that includes removing fake accounts and eliminating or demoting inauthentic behavior. Twitter has a similar censorship policy aimed at platform manipulation originating from bad faith actors located in countries outside the US. These platforms have engaged in strategic collaboration with the federal government, including by sharing information to fight foreign election interference. This is flat out telling everyone that these social media giants work hand in glove with the federal government to restrict your speech. Now, it might be categorized in weasel word nonsense phrases like they have in the article here, but this is no less a fact of everyday reality, especially with us in the activism sphere, that not only are we being censored, but that our accounts are in fact being monitored and targeted. The only way to combat bad speech is with more and better speech. And if that means we have to take to alternative platforms to do so, I am all for that. It's why we're on Rockfin. It's why you should be watching us on Rockfin. And it's why we're going to try and build out the platforms on Mastodon, Minds, and a number of other non-Twitter, non-Facebook sites. And with that, if we could go ahead and start the closeout. I don't know what order we're going in, but I'll back cleanup.
I'll go ahead and go. Yeah, so my name is Kendra Christian, and you can follow Denver Action for Assange at DNV FreeJA on Twitter. And we also have a Proton Mail, which is Denver Action, 2, FreeJA at protonmail.com. And we're always interested to hear from anybody, fellow activists, people with great ideas, people who want to participate more. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Andrew Zigman. My name's Andrew Smith. I'd like to thank all of our awesome guests that joined us tonight, Danny and Kevin. That was an absolutely incredible conversation that touched on almost literally every aspect of broken American society right now. So I really, really appreciate them coming on and joining us. You can find us, all of this, at action_4 Assange on Twitter. We're also on Facebook, obviously YouTube, Rockfin, Periscope. So we're trying to get built up as much as we can so that way we can help people move in that transition off of these heavily censored, heavily monitored platforms. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. And I've been posting in the chat, as well as I'm going to start posting it up on our Twitter, this week's actions. They are different mainstream and alternative media institutions to start asking to cover Julian. We have GoFundMes and donation links up for activists and whistleblowers, as well as petitions to sign and share. So if you could check those out, share around their donation links, share around these petitions, because this is an exceptionally hard time right now for independent journalists.
And my name is Misty Winston, and you can find me on Twitter at Sarcasm Stardust. I want to thank you guys for having me on again and give me a chance to ramble and get some venting out. And thank you to our guests, Danny and Kevin. That was such an awesome conversation. I'm so glad that I got to be a part of it. And other than that, I just kind of want to, encourage everybody to, follow independent media, follow Steve's other show at Slow News Day. Follow the Action for Assange, stuff. Follow Kendra's group in Denver. Make sure you support these groups. Make sure you support independent media, because right now that's the only thing that we have to combat against the propaganda that's being thrown at us is a decentralized independent media. So the more, I mean, if you can't donate, I get it. We're all, in tough situations right now, but just sharing videos from, Steve's channel or this channel or, Jimmy Dore or whoever your favorite content creator is, if they're covering issues that are important to you, try to support them however you can, because that's really our first line of defense against what's going on right now, I think. So yeah, I mean, other than that, just thank you guys for having me on. I appreciate it. And hopefully I'll see you guys all soon.
If you're just seeing me for the first time, my name is Steve Poikonen. I do host a show called Slow News Day. You can find it on YouTube by typing in Slow News Day Podcast into your search bar. I'm also on multiple other platforms, including the Rockfin, where I am bringing you exclusive content at least once a week. So please look for that. You can find me on Twitter at Slow News Day Show. I have a much neglected Facebook page by the same name. And yeah, thanks to Kevin Zeese and Danny Sjursen, and to Kendra and Misty for co-hosting with us tonight. Thank you very much to Sleepy Josh on the ones and twos. And we will see you Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. And before I leave real quick, and I know that everybody's bailing, Sunday, May 3rd, World Press Freedom Day. Incredible panel. Our founding co-host here on the Vigil, Taylor Hudak, will be joining us. We will be featuring Kevin Gistola, Cynthia McKinney, Ray McGovern, and Elizabeth Voss. That is going to be amazing, so make sure you're here for that. We love you guys in the chat. You make the show. We will see you soon. Until then, good luck to us all.